just admit that getting into F1 has become practically impossible at this point by just, you know, winning a championship and being the best? Because even though we're going to get a couple of rookies next year, it does prove that so long as you've got the right connections, it doesn't matter whether you end up in 1st place or 5th place or even 15th. Okay, you might be scratching your head at this one and pointing out to me, but Law, we could have a quarter of the grid consisting of rookie talent next year. Yes, that is true. I am pleased that 2025 could be seeing up to 5 potential rookies joining the ranks if things play out as hoped, and this tweet brought to my attention. But there is one worrying pattern about all of these people listed that does give me cause for concern. If you win the F2 championship, it does not guarantee you the ability to get onto the F1 grid in a meaningful capacity. And if you're Théo Pourchaire, it basically doesn't guarantee you anything. Because this list of 5 drivers that I just shared with you, none of them are currently leading the F2 championship, and that's just making me think that there's a really big issue with the series that it's had for several years at this point, which is not helped one bit by the F1 team's inability to let go of drivers who maybe 10 or 15 years ago should have been let go. Look, I may be relatively supportive when it comes to new fans, modern fans, the Drive to Survive contingent, but this is one symptom of modern day Formula 1 that I really don't agree with, because sometimes there just needs to be a natural order, a progression, an evolution of old drivers going out and new drivers coming in. It keeps things healthy. Because when we saw last year's grid basically become the same as the start of this year's, there was no tide, there was no change, things just remained stagnant. Have 5 brand new drivers on the Formula 1 grid, or at least 5 drivers getting a proper full season if you count Liam Lawson. Kimi, Antonelli and Oliver Bearman over at Prema. You've got Invicta's Gabriel Bortoleto, who was the F3 champion last year. And then of course you've got 2 ex-Formula 2 drivers in Jack Doohan. It's not Doohan, by the way. And then there's Liam Lawson. And you're probably going to be thinking, well, where's Isaac Hadjar in that? Surely he'd be in F1 next year. Well, I mean, considering how long it's taking to get Liam Lawson into Formula 1, I dread to think what's going to happen with Isaac. Is that this time around, only one of the top 3 drivers in the current F2 championship is even getting a look in when it comes to a realistic opportunity in Formula 1 next year. Because what's become really clear to me is that Formula 2, with their brand new car, it's not really fixed things. In some cases, it's just reminded us of all the stuff that F2 is riddled with, and in other cases, it's just made things worse. I recall talking about the situation last year before the brand new cars came along that there was an issue with the series. When you put it in isolation, it's a really good time. The drivers put on a show and there's a lot to get really excited about. There's a lot of jeopardy involved. But as far as I'm concerned, what they've tried to do with this year's F2 car is just simply not worked, because we're supposed to get a really solid bridge between F3, F2, then F1. Just, in my opinion, it's completely skewed, and F3s actually look really flattering in comparison. Because the car is absolutely all over the place when it comes to reliability and pace. It's not gone any closer to emulate an F1 car in terms of lap times. Look, I get it. Much like when the previous car was introduced in 2018, there are going to be some teething troubles when it comes to a brand new machine for teams to get used to, and they are particularly bad in the first year. You get engines blowing up, components not working as they're supposed to, drivers just getting used to the thing when they're used to the previous car, and oh yes, the clutch. That's still a problem. That was a problem, actually, with the 2018 Formula 2 car, which never really went away properly. Drivers stalling on the grid, or stalling when they're coming out of the pits. Seriously, it's a real problem in F2 that seemingly has not gone away and has come back with a vengeance, in particular this year. Why couldn't Formula 2, with this brand new car, do something that Formula 1 does and have some sort of starter motor or something like that? Something that's just a tiny little motor, which is enough to kickstart the engine, so that means you can get moving again, because Formula 1 cars can do that. There's a system in place where they can, if they stall the car or they spin out, they can just kickstart the engine back again without the need of that cattle prod. That I think is something to do with the MGU-K or something like that. But either way, there is a technique or a method in which to do so independently, so why can't F2 do that? It's really good education, but if you're in a similar situation in F1, it just completely divides the series again. And another thing which is ridiculous to me is that the F2 cars are quite a lot slower than the F1 cars, and yet the cars below them are comparatively closer. Now, to compare things relatively fairly, I'm not going to compare the F1 cars of this year to the F2 cars of this year, because the F2 cars are brand new, the Formula 1 cars are a little bit more developed, so let's compare the 2022 F1 cars to the 2024 F2 cars from the Bahrain Grand Prix. The first race, the gap between the pole times were about approximately roughly 11.5 seconds. Okay, that's quite a big gap, especially when you compare it to the F3 times from 2022. That's the first year that modern-day F3 also raced at Bahrain. And the gap between them and F2 is a little over 4 seconds. I think you can tell that this is a little bit skew-whiff. And you want to know what's going to be an even bigger kicker for F2? Is that there's going to be a brand new F3 car coming next year, which then makes the bridge between these two series maybe even smaller. And then it's just like, well, what's even the point of being in F2 anymore? You're not really gaining much in terms of information. You might get more F3 drivers skipping F2 entirely and then being plopped straight into F1. Oh, and by the way, if you don't watch Formula 3, you should really give it a watch because it's absolute bedlam. There's like 30 cars on the track. It's absolutely insane, especially at the start. But I just don't understand the disparity in the gaps. Surely the F2 cars should have been much quicker in their brand new guys. Unless this is in readiness for the 2026 F1 regs, where reportedly they could be a lot slower. Some cases 10 seconds slower than they are right now. That's too much. Suddenly losing 10 seconds, and then maybe the F2 cars are almost right behind them? There's a genuine concern amongst some F1 engineers that their cars that they spent hundreds of millions of dollars on may not be much quicker than F2 cars, which come from a spec series. But I don't expect that to be the case for the long term. I'm pretty sure that the F1 engineers will be able to claw back some performance. But right now, F2 just does not provide the right amount of information and the speed differential for people to get up to speed with. And I believe that was something that Logan Sargent noted, that the gap between F2 and F1 was just simply too great for people to get used to over the course of one season. And considering how cutthroat Formula 1 is right now, if you do not perform by maybe race 4, then a lot of people will just say, oh, get out of it. And then, of course, there's the other bugbear, which has been around the second Formula Series below Formula 1 since the GP2 days. Why on earth is this series still using Mechachrome engines? Because quite frankly, I think it's become par for the course to expect engine failures in F2, especially over the last several years. And whilst it does throw some jeopardy into the mix about who's going to win on a particular weekend, it does start to drag a little bit when it happens almost every single weekend in an era of motorsport where reliability is practically becoming a guarantee. And especially in Formula 1, where you're seeing more races than not of all the drivers making it to the end of a race with no mechanical issues whatsoever. Or if there are mechanical issues, they are pitted before it becomes a real major problem. And I noticed this in this season in particular, that reliability issues really do muddle up the order, where at some races and at some points during this season, I had no idea who was the clear favourite. We all thought it was Zane Maloney, but then he fell off when reliability somewhat improved and other drivers were able to get their day. It's just that it left things really, really unpredictable. Look, we really should be looking after all this time for a more reliable engine supplier which can provide a basic engine, but then you realise, oh, Mechachrome, it's an offshoot of Renault, and they are both French companies. And who is the organiser of F2 and F3? Oh, that's right, the FIA. Of course, it's a French-based organisation. Mechachrome's been joined at the hip with F1 and its feeder series due to its Renault connections going back decades. But these days, those connections are relatively tenuous compared to their times back in the 70s and 80s. Oh, and by the way, you remember how in the 2010s, Christian Horner and Red Bull would constantly complain about the unreliability of the Renault power units? Well, that might have had something to do with the fact that, yeah, sure, Renault developed all of the parts that made the engine. It was Mechachrome's responsibility to actually put the bits together. So no wonder I don't blame Christian Horner for complaining about any of that, because yeah, there was outside companies, and when you get outside companies, there's a feedback loop, and sometimes feedback loops are met. It just gets messy. I personally think that if you really want Formula 2 to be at its full efficacy, that Formula 1 talent could then see F2 talent for all that it is without reliability getting in the way. You need a reliable engine supply, maybe like Ilmor or something, because Mercedes' reliability is practically bulletproof, and people can just get to the end and win through sheer skill, not through pot luck. But then raw speed and skill is another issue that I think is just getting worse at this point. You can't rely on just that anymore. You need to have strong connections and potentially some major sponsors. Because as we've seen with Sergio Perez at Red Bull, the reason why he's sticking around is completely going against the original ethos and modus operandi of Red Bull. They used to be the disruptors of Formula 1, but now, because of what they're doing, they are about to become the disrupted. If you look back to earlier and the 5 rookies with potential opportunities for seats for next year, they all have some kind of foothold in Formula 1 already. And I'm not talking about them being part of F1 academies or anything, because these days that's completely irrelevant. That's not a guarantor anymore. Unless you become the apple of its boss's eye. I mean, Kimi Antonelli needs little explanation. We already know his connections to Mercedes and Toto, but it's been taken up to a whole new level with him more frequently standing behind Toto in some kind of emotional support capacity. I had a source close to the action at the Hungarian Grand Prix, and when Max and Lewis collided at turn 1, Toto got really overly enthusiastic when it came to the situation, and my source spotted Kimi Antonelli basically patting Toto on the shoulder. And also, it's being reported that the deal for Mercedes and Kimi Antonelli to come together next year has been practically signed and delivered, and they're waiting to announce it at the Italian Grand Prix, which makes perfect sense because Kimi, he's Italian. And you know what? Because I'm feeling frisky, I think he'll do an FP1 session during that weekend as well. And which driver he will replace for that session will be all the telling. As for the others, well, there's Oliver Bearman, who seems to be having a miserable time of it in F2 this year, his second year in the series, after a really impressive rookie year where he did a Grand Slam at the Azerbaijan Grand Prix in the older car. But to be fair, he does have innate talent, and 2023 was a really good year for him. He is not terrible. He is a pretty good driver on his day. It's just really not helped that Prema have not figured out this car until just recently. But even then, Kimi Antonelli is the one that's getting more results than Bearman, save for the sprint win in Austria. And even though I am happy for Oliver Bearman and I do wish him well at Haas, the whole situation is just a little bit concerning, because at the moment, if Bearman weren't attached to Haas, a second year where you're 15th in the championship, surely that would not get the interest of an F1 team. But according to team principal Ayo Komatsu, his F2 campaign this year doesn't really matter. It doesn't matter in comparison to the work that he's putting in with Haas themselves during the 6 FP1 sessions that he's been doing. 6! Teams are only mandated to do 2 FP1 sessions, so Haas is really committing to this driver. Really committing. I've never seen this amount of commitment to a reserve driver in Formula 1 ever. But okay, fine. Ayo just wants more relevant information. That's not a bad thing, right, Law? Well, I find this a little bit, interesting, because even though Komatsu rebuffed the rumours about Zhou Guanyu, saying that the team doesn't need paid drivers anymore, that Gene Haas has plenty of money that he now seemingly is willing to invest in, we do also have to remember that Ferrari and Haas are really linked at the moment, and with Mick Schumacher, Ferrari were willing to pay half of Mick's salary that Haas didn't have to commit fully to. And that will probably be the same with Oliver Bearman, half of his salary being subsidised by Ferrari. And then also there is the matter of connections. You recognise the Aventum logo on Bearman's F2 car? Well, that company is run by his dad, and it's an insurance company. And apparently it's actually in good health. It's a really prosperous company with good profits and no debt. So I would not be surprised to see, like you do see with some drivers, that particular logo ending up on the Haas car as a sponsor or something like that. So yeah, I'd just say that Bearman has a lot more support than some other F1 drivers do. But again, it's no fault on Bearman's talent itself. I do wish him well, and I hope that this year in F2 has just been a blip that is mostly Prema's fault, because Prema right now, they have dropped the ball. And there is no denying about what he was able to do with Ferrari in Jeddah, because that was a last-minute deployment, and he carried himself off really well, so that is credit where credit is due. But let's just remember, there is some financial connections to it, but that's just the way you've got to do it in Formula 1 these days. As for Jack Doohan, well, it helps that Alpine's going through a major restructuring phase at the moment, and they need all the internal support that they can get to become a stronger team, devoid of Renault's engine or getting its affairs in order in general before selling up. And it also really helps that Flavio Briatore, who is effectively the manager of Alpine at the moment, save for Bruno Famin and Oliver Oakes and whatnot, he is the hype man for that team, and he is the manager of Jack Doohan. And not to mention, he is part of the Alpine Academy, and right now, especially the legal team of Alpine currently, they do not want any drama or complications when it comes to the Alpine Academy, after what happened with Oscar Piastri and Fernando Alonso, them playing chicken with them. But again, no disrespect to Jack, he was competitive when he was in F2. He's not a bad driver, I do wish him well. As for Liam Lawson, oh man, his situation is just getting silly at this point. I have no clue what's going on with him, and I don't think Red Bull has a clue either. They've got to be doing something with him, or else they're going to lose his services next year. And what that something might be completely escapes me, because now even Helmut Marko is showing double standards when it comes to the situation with Checo. After the Belgian Grand Prix, he said that Checo's form had completely collapsed, but now he's saying Checo's doing just fine. And this is just making the situation with Liam all the more complicated, because Okay, if you're not going to be using Liam in either one of your teams, why don't you put him out to loan like you did with Alex Albon to make sure he had a chance in Formula 1? They're not going to be loaning out any of their drivers, so what do you expect to do with the guy? Does this mean that Liam's now just got to be striking it out on his own or something? We don't know. And I don't think even Daniel Ricciardo knows about what's going on at this point. I think last week he was expecting to be racing for Red Bull alongside Max, but now I don't think he has a clue. Liam's the only one at this moment where he's been able to showcase abilities next to one of the current drivers of a Red Bull team in an actual Grand Prix. But then there's Gabriel Bortoleto, last year's F3 champion and currently runner-up position in F2 behind Isaac Hadjar, who is also facing an uncertain future. I personally think that Gabriel stands a really good chance of becoming the next back-to-back F3, F2 champion, the last one being, of course, Oscar Piastri, and look how well he's doing at the moment. I do rate Bortoleto very, very highly, and I'm not just saying that because he's part of the McLaren development program, because I don't know what that's about. I just think Zach Brown likes to collect drivers like their baseball cards, and with Zach Brown wanting to stick it to Red Bull right now and then seemingly not willing to loan out Liam Lawson, it really wouldn't surprise me that he does the complete opposite and establishes a loan deal with another team to ensure that Bortoleto gets on the grid and gains some experience. And that might be the case with Sauber, since they are running low on options themselves. Not even their Audi transformation is enough to attract other drivers. And out of the 5 drivers on this list, I personally think that Gabriel is the most interesting prospect. Kimi Antonelli is a close second, though, because I do want to see what happens with Toto and Mercedes once he gets in there, and the disparity between him and George. But also, most importantly, we really need a Brazilian in Formula 1. It's just been so sad without Brazil there. If it happens and Bortoleto is confirmed to be in F1, I, along with many millions of people from Brazil, will be chanting, Brazil! But still, one common issue that these 5 drivers have is that they are not F2 World Champions, and the 2 most likely candidates for promotion aren't even in the top 5 of this year's standings. And as for Paul Aron, who's currently in 3rd and at one point was leading the championship through sheer consistency alone, he was once a Mercedes junior driver, probably destined to be in F1 before Antonelli, and him being surged forward. Aron didn't get fired from the Mercedes program. He decided to leave of his own volition because, put simply, the age-old thing about what happened with Verstappen and Toto, they took too long for him to get up to Formula 2. That they wanted him to spend another year in Formula 3, this year in F3, after spending an extra year in Formula Regional. Put simply, Aron's camp was getting too impatient. He felt that he had the skill to be in Formula 2, and what is he showing right now? He absolutely does. And even though he's not setting the world alight in terms of winning races all the time, he's up there all the time, whereas all of the other drivers are just like up one day, down one day, up one day, down one day. You can't tell what's going on, but Aron, he's been a relative constant. Bortoleto somewhat as well. Aron took a gamble to fund his own push into F2 without Mercedes as an independent, and sadly I think that money's about to run out, meaning that if he can't find investment needed for next year, or the new Alpine manager Oliver Oakes doesn't see Aron's potential and then promotes him to work alongside Gasly or as their reserve driver, we could see Aron's star sadly fade away. And all of this is just so sad, and it just shows that there are double standards playing here. Toto is just, again, showing that he's taking too much time with certain drivers. But with Kimi, no, he's more than happy to just rush him through Formula 3, skipping it entirely, and then putting him in an F2 car. He then somewhat flounders at the beginning of the season, and therefore it diminishes his credibility, but then he suddenly comes back again, and then suddenly Toto goes, you see, I told you Kimi does have potential to be in Mercedes. It's so weird at this point. It's like Toto's learned from the mistakes of Verstappen, and yet he hasn't learned. Look, on its own, F2 is a pretty entertaining series with a diverse cast of characters, and I find it hilarious that nobody bats an eye about the sprint feature format there. But you try it in F1, and the rumours are saying that there might be even more coming next year, everyone loses their minds. Because I honestly like the sprint weekends. There's just a lot more to see. I think they've actually got the format down pat and just don't change anything. Keep the format as it is. But as a conduit to Formula 1, right now, it's broken. And the candidates that we might be seeing next year are not looking like true championship prospects, except for the likes of Bortoleto. And Hadjar, I don't know when he's going to be getting into Formula 1. 2026, 2027, 2028. It's complete guesswork with Red Bull drivers at this point. Because what we're seeing with some other drivers is that they have connections, whether they have good sponsors or they have good connections with the management of Formula 1 teams. It's just getting completely muddy at this point. And it just goes back to what the job market is in general. It's not what you know, it's who you know. And with Formula 1's high profile at the moment, brand new drivers who get in and don't hit the ground running are barely given any time by all concerned returned, not just the teams, but fans as well, to do well. And if they don't do well, they are not popular. They become disparaged. They become hated. They are not attractive to sponsors. So therefore, they are dropped within a year, maybe two if they're lucky. It's such a ruthless sport in a way. But I am glad to see that Formula One is somewhat aware of the situation, that what we saw this year is getting a little bit ridiculous with no brand new drivers coming in, just spicing things up and adding some uncertainty and jeopardy. Because I do think that there are some drivers, because there is Sargent, there is Bottas, there's Zhou, there's Magnussen. They're okay, but they are clogging up the system in a way, and they haven't really set the world alight. And yes, of course, the teams, especially Sauber, have not helped the situation, but there is a call for brand new drivers to try and just make things more interesting and see how they interact with the old guard. And I think we can all agree that a little bit of freshness in life wouldn't go amiss, unless Sauber decides to stick with the party line. All together now. Stability and continuity. Yeah. Aren't we tired of that phrase at this point? I just wanted to go back to the days where in GP2, if you won the championship, you were practically guaranteed to get into F1. Nowadays, it seems like being the victor of the series is something nobody wants, because you get a nice trophy, sure, but you can't compete in F2 again to further learn things. And the most realistic pathway for you is to become a reserve driver for an F1 team, or go to IndyCar, which could be the ticket for the most recent F1 driver, as he does have some potent links to it and the incoming Prema operation. To find out why I think Logan Sargent had the perfect opportunity to kickstart his revenge arc, go and watch this video next, because his time in Formula 1 may be ending, but I think the rest of his career is just beginning.